At Belduke6417, if you were in charge of the high school history curriculum in your own country, what would you teach? This is a really interesting question. I talked in the previous Q&A about how I feel the current history curriculum is mostly about teaching students about our current society, why it is the way it is, what ideas we have accepted or rejected over the years, but I hadn't really thought about how I would want to change things if I could. I don't necessarily think that the current history curriculum is a bad way of doing things, although I think it can fall into the best of all possible worlds trap when everything that you study in history looks like it happened for the sake of making things the way they are now. You start to feel like this is the end of history. Things have stopped changing. There are no ideals we failed to live up to, and everything that's different from the way things are here and now is totally unnecessary. So I think I would want to sprinkle in a little more diversity, say, here are some totally different ways of doing things that people have tried. For instance, in a world history course, I would want to teach the Chinese civil service exam, where there was an official test that anyone could take to be involved in government. Maybe spend some more time on 19th and 20th century economic philosophies. Georgism would be a cool thing to bring up, which emphasizes taxes on land rather than labor. Stuff like that, and just sort of challenge students to ask themselves about what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches, and what sort of side effects did they have, and which one do you think you would prefer, and all that sort of thing. I would also want to take some focus away from how wars are fought and place more focus on the diplomacy that comes before and after a war. I can only guess and say that maybe we learn a good bit about battles and things because that's what people at home at the time were reading about in the news and what felt so important to them and were admittedly the reason why wars were won or lost, but I just feel like focusing in on the military strategy is just a little irrelevant. I think in this regard, schools in America do a pretty good job of this for the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. But for instance, I think the Battle of Gettysburg is probably what people of the era were paying attention to. But I think it would be more useful to spend more time in the semester talking about Reconstruction, the 40 acres and a mule idea of post-war reparations, the 1876 election that ended Reconstruction. What was the purpose of Reconstruction? How was it changed? To what extent did or didn't it live up to its intended goals? All that kind of thing. I think the Treaty of Versailles is one that gets a good amount of attention, but I think, for instance, the Atlantic Charter, Bretton Woods, the Congress of Vienna, all of those would be really great to cover in more depth. Great question. Dick Braun 1 asks, I had an awesome history teacher. I didn't have Rackham. Sir, have you considered teaching kids? I have, actually. I had volunteered to teach elementary school kids when I was in high school and college. Teaching them about the solar system. We had a unit on classical civilization. That was a great one. And I accidentally lied to them about what AD means in Latin. I also worked briefly as a camp counselor for an academic summer camp. That was probably some of the hardest I have worked in my entire life. You are on the clock 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 12 a.m. Everything is extremely chaotic because, kids, you have 1 hour to yourself each day and 1 day off every 2 weeks, and the pay was not great, but you do get room and board. So, highly recommend. I loved working with kids. A lot of the kids I was working with were sort of around, the preteen age, which is just at the point where, you really sort of start to see them come into being fully fledged people and, the people that they're going to grow up to be. But that job just didn't quite satisfy everything that I was looking for. I think for a career, I want to have something that feels like I'm creating something new and I have some sense of progression, but I know that at some point in my life, I would really like to go back to teaching or tutoring, even for a year or 1 semester, because it's just really fulfilling. What historical figure that you have covered do you stand the best chance at beating in a fight? What figure do you have the worst chance of beating? Alright, I feel pretty confident that I could take on Dmitry Ivanovich as long as we're talking about the incarnation that died when he was 8 years old, and not his second, third, or fourth lives. FDR's shown up quite a few times in my videos, though I haven't made one explicitly about him. I think I might be able to take him, and I think I would probably lose to all of these people. Why else do you think I make a living talking shit about dead people on the internet? But I would especially lose to Teddy Roosevelt. If he can beat a gunman with his fists, he can beat me. What's the best way to learn a new language? Is there maybe an app created by experienced language educators to prepare you for practical conversations about travel, business, relationships, and more? Oh, that's so crazy. Really awesome question. I was hoping I would get to talk about this today. You're thinking of today's sponsor, Babbel. How quickly can Babbel have you speaking your target language? Just 3 weeks. Abbastanza buono, vero? So you probably know using the app is super easy. You can pick it up at any time. First thing in the morning, over lunch, on public transit. Let me give you my secret. I do a lot of my language learning when I'm procrastinating doing something else. If I can't get myself to do the laundry or start my research, it's just gamey enough to steal my attention, just demanding enough that in 15 minutes I'm ready to put it down, and just productive enough that I'm ready to take on the day. And looking back on how much you've learned feels so rewarding. Now let me ask you a question. What languages would you like to learn? You can get 60% off your subscription using the link below. Thanks again to Babbel for supporting this channel and lifelong learning. Lou the Giant Cookie asks, in your opinion, who is the greatest villain and the greatest hero in history, based on all you have researched? I mean, for villains, Hitler was a really bad dude. Like, it kind of amazes me. I think I expected to find more people throughout history who were just as bad, but couldn't do what he did because of technological limitations. But like, most of the villains that I have come across in history are really incompetent, like all of those false messiahs, or really negligent, like Nicholas II, or they've got some kind of core value or idea that they are just taking way too far, like with Robespierre in the French Revolution, or Santiago Genovese and his sex raft for world peace. Occasionally, you do get people like Leopold II of Belgium, who personally owned the Congo and was treating everybody horribly and chopping off people's hands if they didn't get enough rubber harvested for the day, and his cruelty was basically motivated by pure greed. But then Hitler shows up, says, "Hold my beer," and he's just evil for the sake of being evil. Like, killing millions of people was the end, not the means. That's actually pretty rare in history, although by no means unique. There were a number of genocides in recent centuries especially, although I haven't researched them, so I will give my runner-up prize to Pope Innocent III for the genocide of Gnostic Christians in France in the 1200s. For heroes, that's a lot more challenging because, well, usually I find the villains so much more entertaining, and so I end up doing a ton of research on them. I still hold up Pedro II of Brazil as something close to a model ruler for giving up so much of his own happiness throughout his life for the sake of making genuine improvements to his country and working to abolish slavery. Robert Smalls, the guy who freed the boat full of enslaved sailors and their families in the Civil War, might not have saved the world, but safe to say he was a pretty heroic person. Went on to work in government, too. The samurai Yoshitsune probably isn't the biggest hero, but recency bias brings him to mind. He was this guy who went to great lengths to win the Genpei War of the 1100s in Japan for his brother, only to get betrayed by said brother. Oh, and in a similar vein, I really admire the patience and humility of Ali ibn Abi Talib, one of the Prophet Muhammad's buddies who kept getting looked over for leadership, but didn't get up to any shenanigans, just kept doing his best work. Even once gave up the position of caliph when he was a shoo-in, but basically the board of directors or whomever was in charge came to him and said that he could have absolute power as long as he agreed to like a couple of things, and he couldn't agree to that, stuck with his principles, said he wanted to lead a different way, and then just let them pick somebody else. Poke Castle asks, If you could travel ahead into the future and gaslight future historians over a historical figure from the 20th century with false information, who would it be? I think I could take this in two different directions. I would either want to invent a new historical figure, convince historians that there was someone Forrest Gumping their way through the world in like the 20s through the 60s who just had a ton of influence on world events that are otherwise completely unrelated. Or else, I think it would be fun to invent a conspiracy theory, connect it to someone like JFK or whatever, but make it similar to a normal conspiracy theory in terms of how it's executed and the fact that there is some greater power involved that's very dark and mysterious, but then just like totally make it the opposite of normal conspiracy theories in tone. Make it that actually there is some dark, mysterious force out there pulling the strings, but they just want what's best for us, and we haven't been smart enough to figure it out. So actually everything's fine, and we can all just chill. Warotum 590, am I saying that right? You asked, favorite historical figure's nickname. Oh, I just know that there's some that have come up in my videos or in my research for useful charts that were amazing, but I've completely forgotten them. Ethelred the Unready is a classic. Ivar the Boneless, Pepin the Short, Charles the Bald, Charles the Fat. Alright, I've started looking up some listicles to try to find the ones that I've talked about before. Oh, yes. Constantine Anointed in Urine is great. As long as I'm on this listicle, here are some other good nicknames I see that you might enjoy. Władysław the Elbow High, Ulick of the Heads, Oystein the Fart, and his son, Halfdan the Bad Entertainer, Childeric the Idiot, Cadafael the Battle Decliner, Bermudo the Gouty, Archibald the Loser, Anne, Queen of Bees. I think the Viking ones in there are a bit iffy on historical accuracy, but I hope there's some that you enjoy. Ooh, 2 questions in this one. If, by odds, this does get featured in your Q&A, could you please read it in your best impersonation of Professor Snape? An opportunity to do a silly voice. You know me so well. This is probably a terrible Snape impression. I don't know when the last time I watched an Alan Rickman movie even was. Which historical figure with the moniker the Great do you think is least deserving of said title? Perhaps even a bottom 3. Alright, I don't know if I can do the entire question like this because he has to read it so slowly. I don't know of any greats that stand out to me as especially undeserving. If mythology is acceptable, I was about to call out Ajax the Great for what he did to Cassandra in the Temple of Athena, but then I fact-checked myself and that was Ajax the Lesser. I feel like my honest answer would probably go to some random monarch or aristocrat who got the name and never lived up to it, and so I have never heard of them, because there are a surprising number of the greats out there. I think Wikipedia has a whole list of them. I will also point you to the live stream I did a few years ago that's saved on my Patreon page. My friend and I did a whole competition to decide who was the greatest of the greats, and by process of elimination, you can find out which greats were eliminated in round 1. Shamsquatch 9980, I love the implication that Shamsquatch was already taken. Shamsquatch asks, what do you look for when considering your sources? Are there any stories of a source that seemed promising but ended up being super unreliable or a straight up fabrication? So when I'm doing research on a subject, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm looking through the Wikipedia page. I want to get the outline of the story, I want to get my bearings on the setting, the environment, the broad strokes of what happens, and just get a sense of whether or not this is a story I want to tell. And after that, I like to go looking for one sort of main comprehensive source. So sometimes this can be just a more reputable article to confirm all the basic facts, something pulled from JSTOR, news sites, any other reputable publishers. And sometimes this will be a really deep dive into some big book. I think I had to read a whole book in like 2 days for the Ludwig video, for the Southcott video, as well as large parts of a book for the post-World War II denazification video. The next thing I'll do is I'll try to find sources that fill in all of the gaps, and that will give me an idea of, all right, I know this event happened, but what was everyone's reaction to it, especially sort of the main character of the video? For instance, I found something talking about Hemingway was considered precious cargo on D-Day. And that sort of begs the question of, like, okay, does that imply that he was trying to get to shore and that's why this phrase precious cargo came up? He was told that to his face and that's why he couldn't go to shore? Was he arguing with somebody about this? Or was precious cargo just a term that was sort of invented or quoted from a later author? As far as promising sources that turned out to be misleading, that doesn't happen as often, but there was a case of it recently. I was doing a bunch of research about the diplomacy going on among the Axis powers leading up to World War II, and there's all kinds of ridiculous stuff in there. Like, hey, surprise, Mussolini ended up being the one to stop Hitler from invading Austria in 1934, and surprise, the non-aggression pact that Hitler signed with Stalin that led to them both invading Poland was actually a big spit in the face to Italy and Japan because the Axis powers had originally been organized as an anti-Soviet group. So with all of that in mind, when I learned that when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Hitler was secretly sending Ethiopia weapons in order to make sure that the war went on long enough for Britain and France to put sanctions on Italy, I was like, yeah, that tracks. The Axis was a total circus. It wouldn't be the first time Hitler and Mussolini got in each other's way, and Hitler was clearly a compulsive liar, and not a very good one at that. And this was coming from some book written in the 80s, I think, but I was very disappointed to find out that this is, in fact, a contested piece of information, which is kind of weird that something like that would still be ambiguous when it happened so recently. Another that took me by surprise was when I was reading Ulrich von Liechtenstein's medieval book called In Service of Ladies. That whole book is about this medieval knight who is just the picture-perfect image of a milady, nice guy type character. And discovering, when I started doing some research outside of the book itself, that the whole book is commonly understood by historians as satire was something that was shocking and initially a little disappointing before I realized that, actually, having that level of self-awareness about character traits and tropes that are very relatable to us in the present is still pretty cool. On a similar subject, a question from Schrodinger's Moose: when it comes to legend and myth compared to relatively trustworthy history, do you have a certain ratio you try to achieve? When it comes to subjects like ancient history, do you allow for more of the former than you would for, say, the 19th century? Usually when I'm researching someone like a Yoshitsune, like a Pythagoras, like a Confucius, someone who lived far enough in the past that there just aren't a lot of reliable biographical records from that time period, I sort of know going in that there is going to be a blend of history with legends and myths and sort of all of these stories that are the inventions or misinterpretations of later record keepers. So for those videos, I definitely allow for more of that legend to come in because it's sort of a piece of how this person is remembered. And there are lots of interesting stories out there that it would be a bit of a shame to leave out all of those fun parts. Though I'll try to use phrases in the video like, there's one story about this guy, or according to legend, blah blah blah, just to kind of distance it from the historical fact. Mr. Snufflegums, thank you for writing. You've asked, what inspired the shift from a focus on a specific person's life to focusing more on events as told through the lives of the important figures, like your Iranian Revolution series or the one you did on the start of the Cold War? The answer to that mainly is I was just reading about a bunch of stuff that seemed really interesting. In the case of the Iranian Revolution, I got into that through the first video in that series was all about the coup that the CIA was involved with that put the Shah back in power in the 50s. And I didn't really want to talk about, like, Prime Minister Mossadegh's entire life story, or I couldn't really fit all of the stuff that happened to the Shah after the 50s. So I decided that 100 biography videos was plenty, and I could start branching out a little. Samony SCA asks, how committed are you to history-centric content? / do you see yourself pursuing different formats and content? I don't want to drop history, but pursuing different formats or doing different subject matter is something I really want to do. I just don't feel like I'm quite able to yet, because I think that any new venture that I launch, I would probably want to make it sort of its own thing or its own channel, and I would want to give it the same level of polish and quality that my videos have here. But that just means that it would take a while to get up off the ground and would be a big time and money sink for all of that while. For instance, I feel like the format of my videos would translate really easily into talking about literature or like TV and video game lore. It's just a question of when do I feel I am ready to make that kind of an investment, knowing the inherent risk of doing things on YouTube. But even more broadly than that, I am interested in all kinds of different things. Right now, my goal is finding ways of monetizing this channel. For instance, with the Italy trip that a bunch of you guys went on with me this summer. That was phenomenal, and we're doing another in Japan in May. Links to that in the description. With doing historical figure toy design, just seeing whatever works with my audience. And then with that, try to build out the team working on the channel, use this channel as a place to really hone our production process, and then extrapolate that into some new subjects. That's looking pretty far into the future and crossing our fingers that all goes well, but yes, more broadly, I am interested in all kinds of different things across not just history or even talking about or summarizing narratives, but all kinds of different media and subjects. And if you would like to support that, I've also got a link to the Patreon page. What was up with the Stalin video? I got a question about this in the Q&A post as well as the comment section of that video. I want to talk about it because I don't really get the chance to do videos breaking down my lies and mistakes the way that Extra History does, and I think this one would be an interesting one to talk about. Stalin, I knew this going into it. This one was going to be a touchier subject just because it's one where people are likely to know a little bit more about it and have much stronger feelings about it. Especially when I come out and paint this pretty different picture of Stalin as Moneybags McGee over here, who is corrupting this communist party. I think that video had a couple of issues. I said Lenin died in 1922 instead of 1924. I think that was a dumb typing mistake that will haunt me for the rest of my life, just like the time I said 1492 instead of 1452 when talking about the events leading to the fall of Constantinople. I think if there is one thing that I would change in that video and that I would want viewers to know, it would be to do with how Lenin and especially Trotsky were presented. So as I was making that shift away from purely biography videos to videos that are sort of narrowing in on a particular subject, with a couple of videos like Stalin or Alexander the Great, instead of going through a total comprehensive biography, I wanted to make the most of the time that I have to work on them and really focus in on the one thing that makes them unique to me. For Alexander the Great, I could have talked more about his time in Greece and in Egypt, but I really wanted to share just how insane it was, even for the time period he was in, that his driving foreign policy was just to conquer everything immediately, just 'cause. And so for Stalin, it was the ridiculousness of how the Lenin and Stalin era USSR was run, how the workers of Russia rose up and instituted a communist government that made unions illegal. And so as a result, I knew I was going to get less time to talk about things like World War II, the Holodomor, the purges, but with Lenin and Trotsky, I think in the interest of focusing on what kind of a person Stalin was, I made Lenin and Trotsky look a little bit too high-minded. Like the communist revolution would have ended just fine if Trotsky had been the one to take over and be a good influence on Lenin, because Trotsky in that video is constantly shown as the straight man who is opposing a lot of Stalin's violent or authoritarian policies. So in actuality, Trotsky did make a lot of objections to Stalin. It's just that Trotsky was a hypocrite. Obviously, I didn't do as much research on Trotsky as I did for Stalin, but the Bolsheviks were involved in a whole bunch of crime to fund their party to begin with, and Trotsky was a part of that. He was a part of the Red Terror. He literally wrote a book called The Defense of Terrorism. And if Trotsky had actually gotten a hold of the USSR, his policy of permanent revolution would have basically brought him into war with, like, the rest of the world as soon as possible. And so I think the biggest change that I would have wanted to make is just have, like, even one throwaway line of a character who is just pointing out the extent to which Trotsky was that kind of a hypocrite. From Rudeware, what's your animation workflow? Always been curious about how you design and animate your characters. So this is divided between myself and my team right now. I design the shot list. Here's what that looks like. That then gets sent out. Character scenes and chalk images are handled separately, but in both cases, there is a lot of stitching together different images from across the web. A lot of times, the ground will be taken from one image and the horizon or other parts of the background will be taken from another image, and there will be random props added to the scene. I think in the Hemingway video, the scene designer took a picture from Canada or something and magically turned it into Cuba with some well-placed trees in the foreground and background, and then added in Hemingway's house completely separately, and then aligned the perspective on all of these different images so that it would all be cohesive. We will also, at this stage of the process, assemble any characters who don't have like a full-body portrait or photograph, and often that's using stock images. This is also one of the places where we might use some image generation software to get a character who needs to be wearing the right thing and facing the right direction and in even lighting, and then we will rig them up to be animated, which is basically splitting apart the arms, the legs, all of those major joints, the head on the neck, and then doing a little bit of fill-in painting behind where those joints are so that when they move, you're not seeing these sort of weird holes or gaps in their body. So then when that gets brought into animation, here's a look at what a normal project timeline looks like for a scene, as well as for the chalk images. The rest of the team is using After Effects. I am still using a laptop that cannot handle it, so I animate in Premiere, which is very much not what that program was made for. Here on screen, you've got a couple of examples of scenes that I've animated, although recently I have been animating less so that I can get ahead on researching, writing, sound, etc. I'm still doing all the lip flaps though, and here's what that looks like. Then I will go through and tackle all the sound design and any smaller edits that need to be made before the video goes live. Keegan Decker 4080 inquires, what's with all the AI art? So this is something that has definitely changed since the last Q&A. So, yes, when you get something out of Midjourney or wherever, there is definitely a recognizable AI aesthetic that exists. We try to avoid images looking like AI when we can because, it stands out. And at this point, I have asked people on my team to get rid of images that looked like AI, and then they're like, oh, that is not. I found that one. And likewise, it's kind of, whenever you see comments about people talking about AI art in people's videos, it can be kind of a crapshoot. I feel like usually people are pretty good at recognizing the style, and usually that means it's AI, but it's kind of anyone's guess sometimes. People will also just totally miss images that are 100% AI. I feel like I am a bit of a contrarian on the subject of AI, or at least a contrarian compared to the people who are most vocally talking about it. I think there's a big difference between saying, hey, ChatGPT, write me a script, read it to me out loud, and give me 100 relevant images to put subtitles over, and using AI in a way that furthers your own vision. So here are some of the ways that I'm using it. Make up your mind on whether you think that is chill or not. So when it comes to research, it can be very useful for things like, hey, this source I'm reading is sort of unclear on what specific actions, say, France and Britain took in response to the Abyssinia crisis. Can you look for some sources that touch on the exact sanctions they implemented and when they implemented them? Or, hey, I'm trying to make a point about XYZ. Are there any other examples from history or historians that have interpreted it this way? Or is there anything I should be aware of that might refute this point? Or, I found this one story in history that really tickles me, but it is too short to make a video about on its own. Are there any other stories of a similar nature I should be aware of? And if it gives you a source that has that information and is from a credible place, awesome. If not, oh well, go out and do it the old-fashioned way. Then, when it comes to the writing process, I mean, I'll be honest, ChatGPT is just not a great writer. However, there is a concept in computer science called rubber duck debugging, which is when something's not working, you put a little rubber duck on your desk and you explain the problem to your duck, and just saying it out loud can give you some new insights on how to fix it. So while ChatGPT may not be a good writer, it can be a good rubber duck. And then for images, I mean, I started out on this channel using pre-existing images because I can't draw, and that was great. But if I ever wanted to get creative with camera angles, costumes, artistic styles, and aesthetics, any of that stuff, that sort of thing was just really hard to do without generative image tools. So having that lets us devote more effort to telling the story the way that we want to tell it. A question from Thomas Takes a Toll for the Dark 2231. Since your last Q&A, have you developed an interest in a particular culture, person, or country that you hadn't been interested in before? The 20th century, definitely. I used to avoid it so much. Then I started doing a bunch of mid-century and World War II research, learned about the Atlantic Charter, how the UN was formed, denazification, how the Cold War began, diplomacy amongst the Axis, all of this stuff. Same deal with learning about Iran in the 70s. I think 20th century history can be a lot more obtuse than pre-modern history, with all of the complicated internal politics and diplomacy that goes on in liberal democracies. But what really helped me start to untangle it was to just get very granular and look at the stories of how one singular circumstance got from point A to point B, rather than to look at the story of an entire country between the years X and Y, like you can sort of do, or at least get away with a little bit easier with pre-modern history. Doc Martian 6938 would like to know, what is one old video 5 or more years old that you wish you could redo? Top answer to that has to be Nero, because I already did make an attempt to do a soft redo of that video when I made the video that compares Nero's mother Agrippina with the Byzantine Empress Irene, both of whom had very adversarial relationships with their sons. Nero's story has long fascinated me. There's an old draft of a screenplay I wrote in university buried in my folders somewhere that was an attempt to do like a death of Stalin treatment to Nero's story, basically turn this tragedy into a black comedy. And I would really like to revisit that one day for my own amusement too. I was also rewatching the Hong Xiuquan video recently. I think some of the videos from when I had just switched over to the chalkboard format, which I guess would only be about 4 years ago, they sort of suffer from this filter that makes the pictures look more like actual chalk drawings than they do now, but they just get kind of messy. So I think cleaning that one up and doing a better animation for his trip to heaven and his anime swords and the Taiping Rebellion would be super cool. And I wish I could redo the Isabella of Castile video just to recreate the Spanish Inquisition joke. I don't know how many people would even know this at this point, but for the first month when I released that video, when I had maybe 100 subscribers, I gave it the title and thumbnail of James Polk, and then started the video like this.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.